Hello, everybody. I just got home. I've got 15 minutes before I need to be back at work, but I wanted to take this time to make a quick video. So my name is Zach Dyson. I have the hiccups. This is Dungeon Master Design, and today I'm going to say something a little controversial. Controversial? I think standard array can be more fun than rolling your stats. And I know most of you probably disagree with me. Okay, so the hot take is out of the way. You know that I am biased towards standard array, but I don't want you to hear me say that I don't think rolling your stats is valid, or I don't think that rolling your stats is fun. Actually, I think there are a lot of benefits to rolling your stats, but I feel like standard array in the D&D community gets kind of a bad rap. It gets dumped on a little bit. It's the underdog of the stat generation methods. So I wanted to come to standard array's defense today and talk about why I think it exists, why I think it has the numbers that it has, and why I think that it can actually be more fun in your game. But before we talk about that, I do want to cover my bases here. I'm assuming that if you clicked on this video, you're at least kind of familiar with the different ways to generate your ability scores in Dungeons & Dragons. But in case you're not, I'll just give a quick, brief overview. Your ability scores in D&D are those things that determine how good you are at pretty much everything in the game. It's strength, dexterity, charisma, wisdom, intelligence, and constitution. Probably not in that order. I always get the order wrong, but those 6 things are called your ability scores, and the higher the number, the better you are at that thing. Now, here's the question. Where do you get those numbers from? How do you determine how good you are at all of your different skills? That's where your ability score generation method comes in, or your stat generation method comes in. You can either roll your stats, or you can use the standard array, a pre-generated set of numbers, which I think is 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8. So first, let's talk about rolling your stats, because I do want to give rolled stats their fair shake. Like I said, I have no problem with rolling stats. I think that rolling your stats can actually be very fun, and here's a few of the reasons why. First of all, rolling your stats creates a little bit of randomness in the game. And D&D is a game that's all about randomness. It's a game about rolling dice. So in a certain sense, it does make sense to roll your stats as well. It can also be fun because even if you have a preconceived notion about what kind of character you want to play, when you roll your stats, it may give you a little bit of a different idea about who your character is. If your character has one really good ability score and one really bad ability score, that can help you determine who they are. Maybe they're really good at charisma, but they have a really, really low intelligence, meaning that they're really nice and they're great to get along with, and they can even convince people of their point of view, but maybe their points of view aren't very well conceived. And so you get this kind of off-the-cuff, wild-cracker, crackpot conspiracy theorist who convinces people of all these wrong theories. And that kind of character can only come about through rolled stats. Now, when we say rolled stats, there are a couple different things that people might mean. There are a couple different ways to roll your stats. But most people, when they talk about rolling their stats, are referring to rolling 4d6 and then dropping the lowest d6. And so then you add together the top 3. So maybe you roll a 6, a 6, a 6, and a 1. Well, you would drop the 1, and then you would get 18 by adding the 3 6s together. But there are other ways to roll your stats. Some people do 2d6 plus 6. So you guarantee that you're going to have at least an 8 in every stat. Some people like to just roll 3d6, and whatever number you roll, that's what you get. And if they're particularly crazy, they'll roll 3d6 straight down the line. So 3d6, and the number you get, that's your strength. 3d6, the number you get, that's your dexterity, and they don't get to rearrange where the numbers go. And that really will create a randomly generated character. There are also some other way less used methods, like there's one that uses d4s, I think, and there's one that's like 1d8 plus 8, and some people just roll a d20, and whatever the number comes up on the d20, that's their stat. So it could be as low as 1 or as high as 20. But like I said, all of those are really uncommon ways to roll your stats. And when most people talk about rolling your stats, they talk about 4d6, drop the lowest. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, like I mentioned earlier, one of the benefits of rolling your stats is that there's a sense of randomness to it. You aren't really sure what you're going to get when you start rolling your stats for your character, and the results might surprise you in a really fun and meaningful way. But because most people prefer 4d6 drop the lowest over all of those other random generation methods, I tend to think that there's more to the story than just the randomness of rolling your stats. I think a lot of people like this generation method because it generates characters with more than likely higher stats than you would get by using the standard array. Whereas the standard array is 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8, the average rolls for rolling your stats with 4d6 drop the lowest is 16, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 9. And while that doesn't sound like a significant difference, when you're talking about the average rolls of 6 different stats with 4 different dice for each stat, that is a significant increase in the average, and overall it's going to change the balance of the game. So let's talk about this from the perspective of a player, and let's talk about this from the perspective of being a DM. And since there are usually about 5 players for every 1 DM, I'll start with the player's perspective because I'm assuming most of you are players. As a player, it can be very tempting to have higher stats, to be more powerful. After all, playing Dungeons and Dragons is, at the end of the day, a power fantasy, right? You are portraying a character that you couldn't otherwise be in real life, whether that be through martial prowess or through glibness and persuasiveness or through your ability to cast spells and use magic. You are fulfilling some fantasy in your D&D character that you couldn't fulfill in real life. It's a power fantasy. Now, that's not to say that all players are power gamers or that all players are min-maxers or anything like that. I don't think that that's true, but I do think that players prefer to be stronger because it makes them feel better about the power fantasy that they're trying to portray through their character. But here's the problem. If that were really true, if we really just wanted to be as powerful as possible, why not just make all of our stats 20? Why not just start at level 20 and be as powerful as you possibly can be right at the beginning of the game? Well, I think we know that that would be unsatisfying, right? It wouldn't be as fun to just start out as powerful as possible. You haven't earned it. It doesn't feel right. Fighting goblins wouldn't be any fun if you were 20th level right from the beginning of the game. In a certain sense, starting out weaker actually makes the power fantasy more satisfying and more real. Hugo Martin, the creative director for Doom Eternal, says this about creating power fantasies. And if you've ever played Doom Eternal, you know he's pretty good at creating the power fantasy. He says, the power fantasy that is earned is far more satisfying than the one that is just handed to you. If all you had to do was button mash in order to slay slews of demons in Doom Eternal, it wouldn't be nearly as satisfying as mastering all of the weapons and the movement and the strategies that all the demons use and the strategies that you need to use to defeat them. And when you master all of those strategies and weapons, you do feel very powerful. But at first, you die a lot and you don't feel powerful at all. You have to earn the power fantasy. And in the same way, I think that D&D's power fantasy, at least on a certain level, needs to be earned. And one of the best ways that I've seen to do that is through the standard array. The standard array is just slightly weaker than the average of rolling your stats. But like I said earlier, just those few numbers, one number less on the average, can make a huge difference in the way the game feels. If you've ever started a campaign at level 1 and felt like the goblins and the, CR 1/4 monsters just weren't very threatening and not very fun to fight, it might be because your character was too powerful at level 1. After all, rolling your stats gives you the possibility of having a 20 in an ability score at level 1. And a 20 is supposed to be the apex of what the most powerful people in the universe are capable of accomplishing. And if you start out the game at level 1 with the apex of your stat, there's not very much room to grow. You don't have anywhere to go from there. How can you grow in power if you're already the most powerful? And where's the suspense if you know that you're going to hit that goblin every time you roll? Ultimately, D&D is based in storytelling, and stories are reliant on suspense. You need to ask the question, will the heroes succeed? Will they be able to come out on top? And when your stats are too high, often that question is not really a question. And when you know the outcome of an encounter before the encounter starts, well, that encounter is not going to be very interesting. There should be some level of mystery, some level of suspense, some level of uncertainty when you face a foe in Dungeons and Dragons. So from a player's perspective, I think having at least some of your stats be lower than the maximum is really fun because it makes every encounter a little more deadly. It makes every victory feel more earned, and it makes every setback just that much more devastating. It makes the story more interesting. And then also in a meta sense, rolling your stats, while it is fun that it's random, can also create some power imbalance among the players at the table. One player might have all of their ability scores be above a 15, and one player might have all of their ability scores be 12 or lower. And that feels bad both for the powerful player and for the weaker player. The powerful player feels guilty that the whole party has to rely on them and that they always hit and they never miss and that everything they do succeeds, whereas the less powerful player feels bad that this other guy does everything better than he can and that he can't contribute to the overall success of the party as well. Ultimately, while there are a lot of pros to rolling your stats, these are just some of the cons that I have seen. Again, I don't want you to think that I am against rolling stats. I play in several games where we roll our stats and it's a ton of fun. But I just want to set the stage for what the argument is for Standard Array. And in order to fully set that stage, even for the player's perspective, we need to talk about what it's like to be a DM with players with rolled stats or players with Standard Array. So we already mentioned that rolling your stats is random and it can create some power imbalances both in the game as a whole and among players at the table. And when you begin to think of things like a DM and like a game designer, which, by the way, if you're a DM, you are a game designer. I didn't know if you knew that, but that is the reality. As a DM, you are a game designer, and so we need to learn how to think about things from a game design perspective. And as a DM and as a game designer, having that imbalance, having that randomness makes it very hard to design satisfying encounters. I'm editing this video and I realized I forgot to mention something that is pretty important for understanding why Standard Array is so much different than rolling your stats, especially when talking about the randomness aspect of D&D, because again, that is one of the big arguments for rolling your stats, is that D&D is a game about rolling dice, so why not roll your stats too? And I just mentioned in here about how difficult it is to balance the game when you roll your stats, and why is that different than balancing the game against a d20 roll or balancing the game against an attack or a damage roll when all of those are random as well? And one thing that I realized that I didn't mention is that rolling your stats is randomizing one of the things that are designed in 5th edition to balance the game in spite of it being random, because your stats are going to generate your AC. Your stats are going to generate your attack bonus, those things that mitigate the randomness. And so rolling your stats can really throw off the balance of the game in major ways, because it changes the randomness of the rest of the game. Okay, back to the, old me. A lot of DMs complain about how the CR system in Dungeons and Dragons doesn't really work. A CR5 monster is supposed to be a good challenge for a party of 4 or 5 level 5 players. But often you put a CR5 monster against your level 5 players and they absolutely trounce it. Or maybe that CR5 monster absolutely trounces them. And it has nothing to do with bad rolls or poor decisions, it's just the balance of the encounter seemed to be off. And I'm willing to bet that the same people who struggle with the CR system in the Monster Manual are also the people who tend to roll their stats rather than using Standard Array. Rolling your stats just throws off the balance of the game. It either makes you too powerful or not powerful enough. And that's because the CR system is balanced for the average rolls. And the average rolls are the Standard Array. The CR system and the Monster Manual and Dungeons & Dragons as a whole is designed around the Standard Array. And to prove this, you have to look no further than the Fighter. The Fighter gets more ability score improvements than any other class in the game. And that's because Wizards of the Coast needed to balance the Fighter against all of the other classes who have magic abilities and sneak attacks and key points and all these types of things that the Fighter just doesn't have. Their edge in combat is supposed to be that their stats are just naturally higher than everybody else's. But when everyone's stats are already as high as they can be, where does the Fighter have to go from there? Sure, he could pick some feats instead of taking the ability score, but at the end of the day, taking a feat just isn't as powerful as increasing your ability score to get that extra +1 on your attack rolls and damage. Not to mention the fact that this takes away the Fighter's options when they're creating their character. Either their stats are too low and they just have to take the ability score in order to keep up with everyone, or their stats are already maxed and they have no other choice but to take a feat, even if they don't want a feat for their character. Ultimately, the entire game of Dungeons & Dragons makes the assumption that all of your characters will be built using the Standard Array. And yes, the game still works when you roll your stats or when you use point buy, but the game just seems to work smoother when everyone is based in the Standard Array. And when your DM can balance encounters and balance the characters at the table better, then everyone is going to have more fun. The challenge of the DM is to create encounters that are perfectly balanced for their party. After all, the DM can throw whatever he wants at the players. He could throw a Tarisk at level 1 players and end the campaign in one encounter. And he could throw a band of 3 goblins at level 20 players and have those goblins be absolutely annihilated before the first round of combat is done. But both of those things are not fun. And the reason is because both of those things are not balanced. The more balanced your encounters are, the more fun your encounters are, because then you can come out on top, you can earn the victory, but it doesn't feel too easy, and you've earned that power fantasy. In addition to that, growing stronger feels really good as a player when you start weak and end the campaign feeling godlike and unstoppable. That feels really good. There's the immediate power fantasy of winning the battle, but there's also the long-term power fantasy of seeing how far you've come. When your stats start out lower, it also gives you the opportunity to grow into those higher stats. So that's my defense of Standard Array. The rules of Dungeons & Dragons and the stat blocks in the Monster Manual were all designed around characters made with Standard Array. I think that it's easier, especially for new DMs, to balance their encounters when their characters in their party are built with standard array, and the characters themselves are going to have less of a power differential in their party. But again, this is just my opinion. I prefer standard array. I use standard array in my games, but that doesn't mean that you have to, and I play in several games where we roll our stats, and honestly, I have a really good time. So how do you generate your stats? What's the weirdest stat generation method that you've ever used? Do you use 4d6 drop the lowest? Have you ever done 3d6 straight down the line, you absolute mad lad? How did that go? Tell me down in the comments all the different ways that you've generated your stats. But until then, my name is Zach Dyson. This is Dungeon Master Design. Thanks for watching.